This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. New Haven has received national attention after a city man was arrested and injured while in police custody. 36-year-old Richard Randy Cox remains hospitalized and is paralyzed from the neck down, according to his family and attorneys. National Civil Rights Attorney Ben Crump criticized the actions of the New Haven Police Department on Tuesday during a press conference.
I am here because when I look at that video, it shocks my conscience. And I believe when you all see the video, it's going to shock your conscience. The only question is, why when the police look at Randy Cox saying, I can't move, why doesn't it shock their conscience?
My neck is broken.
Why when he said, I can't move, my arms, I can't move, that they didn't use their training. They didn't use their professionalism. They didn't use the policies that they all supposed to know. Why didn't they use just an ounce of humanity?
That audio is from Connecticut Public's Kay Perkins. Now, video of Cox's arrest and how New Haven officers interacted with him that day is on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. 5 New Haven police officers have been put on paid administrative leave while the state police investigate. Coming up, Where We Live, we hear from New Haven Mayor Justin Elicker and the city's assistant police chief, Karl Jacobson. He's the mayor's nominee to become chief. First, Tom Breen joins us, the managing editor of the New Haven Independent. He and his colleagues have been covering this story in depth. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Lucy.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So I mentioned Richard Randy Cox. Tell us what happened that day. How did he get injured, Tom?
I'd be happy to, and I would love to just begin by repeating how you all began this segment, which is to repeat that a man named Richard Randy Cox is currently hospitalized and paralyzed after suffering serious injuries to his neck and spine while in police custody. State police are investigating. City police will conduct their own investigation. This matter will likely be litigated in criminal and civil court. That'll reveal a lot about how police officers responded in this situation. But first and foremost, a very real man is very seriously hurt, and his and his family's life will likely never be the same because of it. So how did this happen? On the evening of Sunday, June 19th, city police arrested a 36-year-old New Haven man named Richard Randy Cox on a few weapons charges at a block party in the New Hallville neighborhood of New Haven. After being taken into custody without incident, officers ultimately placed him in the back of a police prisoner transport van to bring him to the detention center at police headquarters downtown. That van did not have seat belts. Mr. Cox's hands were cuffed behind his back, and several blocks into the ride, the officer driving the van stopped abruptly after speeding or appearing to speed to avoid a car crash. That abrupt stop sent Mr. Cox flying headfirst into the front wall of the van, where he appears to have suffered some pretty severe injuries to his neck and spine. The officer driving the van stopped several blocks later to check on the condition of Mr. Cox. The officer then called for an ambulance, but instead of following department protocol and waiting for an ambulance and medical crew to come treat the injured passenger on site, the officer continued driving to the detention center about another mile, where the officers and supervisor at the detention center pulled Mr. Cox's crumpled body out of the back of the van, put him in a wheelchair, processed him while he was in a wheelchair, said that when Mr. Cox protested and said that he couldn't move, that he thought he broke his neck, the officers and sergeant there said that he was just drunk, that he wasn't trying hard enough, and they ultimately dragged his limp body into a cell where they cuffed his ankles and closed the door. In that detention cell is where an ambulance crew ultimately assessed him and then brought him to the hospital for surgery. He subsequently had 2 surgeries on his neck. He's going to have another surgery on his back, according to his local lawyer, and he remains paralyzed from the chest down except he can move one of his hands a little bit, is my understanding.
And Tom, we know all of this because the video that's been released by the city, it's a video inside that police transport van where Mr. Cox was seated. There's cameras that the police wear. And so when you watch all of this, there are many moments that are very disturbing, especially when you hear Mr. Cox say that he thinks he broke his neck, that he can't move, and the way the police officers interacted with him.
Yeah, it is an incredibly difficult video to watch. So Ben Crump, who's a nationally prominent civil rights attorney and personal injury lawyer, who's best known for his representation of the families of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Trayvon Martin, he held a kind of town hall or community conversation with the NAACP a few days ago, in which he kind of previewed the argument he might make in court in a civil case about the injury sustained by Mr. Cox. And he said again and again during that meeting the importance of watching that video, of making sure that everyone who is interested in this case, that everyone who cares about how the police treat detainees watch this video. And I know you'll be talking to the mayor and assistant police chief in a few minutes. The administration released over 2 hours of police body cam footage and footage from inside the van within 2 days of this incident taking place. And that video shows a lot. It shows the injury sustained by Mr. Cox after the abrupt stop in the van. It shows the officer who drove the van checking in on Mr. Cox and calling an ambulance, but then continuing to drive to the detention center. And then some of the most painful and difficult to watch material in that footage is how Mr. Cox is treated at the detention center by the officers who believe that he's just drunk or that he's not trying hard enough to move. The officers who pull his clearly injured body out of the van into a wheelchair, drag him into a cell. It's very, very difficult to watch, but also essential to understand exactly how high the stakes are and what exactly is being debated here.
You're hearing Tom Breen here on Where We Live. He's managing editor of the New Haven Independent as we talk about this case where, again, a city man remains hospitalized. His family says almost entirely paralyzed after what transpired after an arrest and the involvement of the New Haven police. You can join us, especially if you're a New Haven resident. We'll be speaking with the mayor and the assistant police chief. Our number, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Now, a few times you've mentioned that police believe he was intoxicated based on some of the comments that were made to Mr. Cox. But tell us how that would relate to a policy that officers would follow when interacting with someone they believe is intoxicated, Tom.
Yeah, the body cam footage from the officers who initially arrested Mr. Cox at the block party in New Hallville, that body cam footage shows that at the time that he was detained, that he was holding some bottle of alcohol. And I believe that that's one of the biggest reasons why officers believe that he was intoxicated at the time. The video inside the transport van also shows, before the abrupt stop, shows Mr. Cox kind of lying on the floor of the van, kicking against the wall before he sits up on the bench, the kind of seatbeltless bench in the van, and then goes flying forward and injures himself. Now, the department protocol requires officers to seek out immediate medical assistance when a prisoner being transported sustains a serious injury. And the officer who was driving the van here called for an ambulance after checking on Mr. Cox mid-route, but then instead of waiting for an ambulance to come on site, he ordered the ambulance to meet them at the detention center, and he continued driving to the detention center. That officer, again, according to all the body cam footage released by the police department and the mayor's office, the body cam footage shows that the officer who was driving the van, when he arrives at the detention center, he lets at least the supervisor know that the man says he fell, that he says he injured himself, but then upon opening of the doors, the supervisor and the officers at the detention center treat him, frankly, as if he's just not telling the truth, as if he's just kind of faking it, as if he just doesn't want to move, as if, to quote one of the officers, he's not trying hard enough to move. This goes, I think, counter to all kind of prevailing medical opinion, which is that if someone is seriously injured, especially to their neck or spine, the most important thing is to not move them until they're able to get medical treatment. But also in New Haven Police Department protocol, if someone is that injured, the officers are required to call for medical help, to have a medical team address the situation first before they proceed with, processing him and throwing him in a cell or dragging him in a cell.
Again, you can see parts of that video that was released by city officials at our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. The inside of these police transport vans, to describe it for listeners, it looked like it was all metal. And as you mentioned, Tom, no seatbelt. And so when we think about just, safety in the terms of when you're driving around, to not be seatbelted and you're on a surface where you can easily slide when there is an abrupt stop, to understand how this happened.
Yeah, I think that's one of the more shocking elements of all of this for people trying to understand what happened, is that, in 2022, people who are handcuffed and detained and put in a metal box are not required to, and could not even be buckled into a seatbelt in this van because there were no seatbelts. There were loops on the wall of the van that prisoners are instructed to hold onto with their hands cuffed behind their backs. But this is 7 years after Freddie Gray's fatal, quote unquote, rough ride in Baltimore, a different situation where I believe that there were seatbelts in that van and he was unsecured. But here we have 7 years later, a man in New Haven put in the back of a seatbeltless box, and then because of an apparent attempt to avoid a car crash, he suffers a very serious injury and now is hospitalized and paralyzed.
Something else that you had said, medical protocol, if someone is suspected of having a neck injury, to not move them. I think most people listening right now know that, whether it's personal experience or watching sports, they understand you don't move someone. And the fact that he was moved, he was dragged, he was picked up and dragged again.
This gets at, I think, some of the more kind of biting critiques that, again, Attorney Crump and the local attorneys who are representing Mr. Cox, that Mr. Cox's family and other civil rights advocates locally have said, which is that the clear disregard for Mr. Cox's but apparent state of distress, very visible state of distress, and protestations that he could not move, that disregard reflects something very wrong with how the police department treats people, treats young Black people. A lot of the family members and attorneys have said that there's an assumption that when you are arrested and arrive at the detention center, that because of whatever charges you may be facing or just the situation that you're in, that you must not be telling the truth. It either speaks to how jaded the officers at the detention center are, that they've experienced so much of people appearing to fake illnesses, or just a real disregard for the well-being of people in their custody.
I'm thinking back to, not only this story, but the coverage that you and your colleagues have been doing at the New Haven Independent, looking at several issues within the police department, starting with leadership. Can you briefly tell our listeners about, some of the other issues within this department?
Yeah, I think that the police department has had quite the controversial year. For one, so as you said, Karl Jacobson has been tapped by the mayor to be the next permanent police chief. He's currently the assistant chief. Before that appointment, the mayor had nominated another assistant police chief who was kind of in limbo, an interim chief for about a year. The city's legislature, the Board of Alders, ultimately rejected her for a number of reasons, allegations that Black officers were being disciplined more strictly than white officers, that the top ranks of the department had become all white for the first time since the 90s, that a militaristic approach to policing had replaced community policing, and maybe most importantly, or on top of all of that, the department was solving far fewer major crimes than other comparable departments. There were only 3 arrests made in the 25 homicides that took place in New Haven last year. Now, this year, fortunately, there have been many, many fewer homicides, only 5 in New Haven so far, compared to 15 at this time last year. And the department has made quite a few arrests of cold cases of murders that go back a number of years. But I think the critique of the previous police administration that I think continues to this day. It will be interesting to see if Assistant Jacobson can bring back what he's described a number of times, including in his confirmation hearing before the Board of Alders, as legitimacy policing, as a strong trust between community and New Haven police to help solve a lot of those crimes and to help instill a sense of trust between community and the police officers in the city.
Before we head to break, Tom, what is morale within the New Haven Police Department? One of our team members at Connecticut Public sending a note that there have been several issues with particular officers in recent years. One was suspended for an incident in a traffic stop in July of 2021. Another was fired in April after being on paid leave for a pattern of untruthfulness and mishandling cases throughout 2020. Another suspended for the mishandling of a domestic violence case. The unfortunate death of another officer in Las Vegas in a car crash, a fellow New Haven officer charged with drunk driving in that case. What are you hearing from city residents about, all of these instances?
And I would add to that even some cases that did not result in any discipline or arrest. In January of 2021, an officer who was kicked by a suspect responded by grabbing him by the neck, punching him 3 times in the head, and pepper spraying. He was ultimately cleared of all wrongdoing by the city's own internal investigation. But those types of incidents have reverberated across the city. I think that there is there's a sense of a kind of breach of trust, of skepticism of the police having the welfare of the public in mind. Now, of course, as former New Haven police chief and kind of the next Yale police chief, Anthony Campbell, said in support of Karl Jacobson's nomination to be police chief on Monday night, and said, the police department recruits from the human race like anyone else, like any other profession, and that you have lots of very upsetting incidents or people misbehaving there as elsewhere. But I do think that this pattern of also quite a few, I think at least 7 officers over the past 4 or 5 years have been arrested on domestic violence charges. There's, I think, a real concern among some members of the community that police officers who do misbehave are either not held accountable, or there is not adequate training, or this just keeps happening again and again, and culminates in something as tragic as what happened with Mr. Cox.
You've been hearing Tom Breen, managing editor of the New Haven Independent. Tom, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lucy.
You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we're going to hear from the city's Assistant Police Chief, Karl Jacobson, and New Haven's Mayor, Justin Elicker. If you live in New Haven, what questions do you have for them? 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel.
Why didn't they believe George Floyd when he said, "I can't breathe," 28 times? Why didn't they believe Eric Gardner when he said, "I can't breathe," 19 times? And why didn't the New Haven police officers believe Randy Cox when he said, "I can't move"?
That's civil rights attorney Ben Crump in New Haven on Tuesday, now representing the family of Richard Randy Cox. They plan to file lawsuits after Cox was injured in a police transport van and is now paralyzed from the neck down. He remains hospitalized. Joining us now on Zoom is New Haven Mayor Justin Elicker and New Haven Assistant Police Chief Karl Jacobson. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Yes, thank you.
New Haven residents can also join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I wanted to start with Assistant Chief Karl Jacobson, who is the mayor's nominee to be permanent chief. The Board of Alders still need to approve that. But Assistant Chief Jacobson, what was your reaction when you saw these videos?
Well, I was deeply disturbed, very hurt by the actions of the officers. This is not the way we should treat people. We're here to help people, to keep people safe, especially people in our custody. And just very disturbed, very disturbed.
Were you angry? I found myself, when I watched this video, really angry that people are treated this way, especially by public servants.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been a police officer for over 24 years, and I take a lot of pride in the job that we do here in New Haven. And, yes, very angry, and but also passionate about making change and making sure this doesn't happen again. And if I could just take 1 second to say that the New Haven Police Department is praying for the Cox family and Randy Cox for his speedy recovery. This is a very devastating thing. To our community, to our police department, and we want to do everything we can to change this.
When we think about your police department, the officers that you know, that you've worked with for many years, when I see this video, and now we know that 5 officers are on paid administrative leave, does it speak to the fact that because protocols were not followed multiple times, just watching these videos, that training is an issue within your department?
Well, there's 2 issues. There's training and complacency. And I think training, we need to do more of. We always need to do more of. We always talk about that. But also leadership. Strong leadership will overcome complacency. We've been through some influx over the last few years, and just go back to 2007 when I came here. We've had 9 different chiefs, and that change at the top constantly leads to complacency. And we need to have strong leadership for a long period of time. And we have had some issues, but the overall majority of officers are deeply committed to the community, and they go out every day doing a very difficult job to protect the community. And those officers are upset and mad as well.
You mentioned complacency, but also just the lack of compassion that was shown to this man, who communicated more than once that he was hurt, that he couldn't move, that he thought his neck was broken. I wanted to quote one of the officers at the detention facility when he said at that point, after being dragged off the van and put in a wheelchair, that he thought that his neck was broken. And the officer said, "You didn't crack it, you just drank too much." How do you respond when you hear your officers say something like that?
You're saying it again, and I'm disturbed and angry again. And, we have to respond swiftly. That's why we turned it over to the Connecticut State Police on the criminal side. And we will respond swiftly in the internal affairs investigation. But it is a process, and we have to let the process take time. But based on the videos, we're extremely angry about this, and we want to make sure that this never happens again.
You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677. You're hearing New Haven Assistant Police Chief Karl Jacobson. He is the mayor's nominee to be permanent chief as we talk about this very disturbing story out of New Haven, a city man now hospitalized. His family says and almost entirely paralyzed after being injured after an arrest in mid-June. New Haven Mayor Justin Elicker is with us. How do you respond to what your Assistant Police Chief shared in terms of the complacency and the training that's needed after this disturbing story?
Yeah, I think that what happened to Mr. Cox was just awful and completely unacceptable. It clearly falls short of the high standards that we have in the New Haven Police Department and the values of our city, and it's not going to be tolerated. We worked very hard and continue to work very hard to respond quickly and decisively and openly about this incident. We put 5 officers on leave, alerted the public within 24 hours of the incident, released videos that encompass the entire length of the incident within 48 hours of the incident. And there's an ongoing investigation both by the state police and an internal affairs investigation has been open. There's been a lot of questions about culture in the police department. I think that these are really important questions to have. In my view, having watched the videos many times, I don't think from what I have seen that there is a culture of police brutality in the New Haven Police Department, but seeing the 5 officers that were involved in the incident, there was an extreme callousness. And I also think that it's important for us to foster a culture of intervention, of officers having the tools and the support that they need to stop other officers when they have questions about following procedure. Are we doing the right thing? Are we treating someone correctly? We're working to implement more training that is in this vein of duty to intervene. I think we think of duty to intervene after George Floyd's murder. Duty to intervene also means when officers may be doing something that is not following protocol or not treating someone with ultimate respect, that other officers have the tools that they need to ensure that we're providing the best service for New Haven residents, the most compassionate service. No matter what someone did, they, when in police custody, deserve to be treated safely and respectfully. And in my strong view, that was not done here.
You mentioned that you don't believe this is a culture of police brutality, but when you see the way these officers interact with this man, how does this happen? That somebody can be communicating with the officers that there's something wrong, and he is ignored and mocked at one point. How does that happen? If it's not a culture of police brutality, what is it, Mayor Elicker?
Yeah, I think that we've all been asking ourselves this question too, watching these videos. How could these officers have done this? And the officers had an attitude of mistrust of the individual, despite Mr. Cox asking for help. And I think I've talked with Mr. Cox's mom a number of times. I can't imagine what she is going through. Mr. Cox's life has changed forever. We want to make sure that this never, ever happens again, and are committed to ensuring that it does not.
Assistant Chief Karl Jacobson is still with us. When we look at the officers at the detention facility, they're also interacting with Mr. Cox. Is there an issue with training there? What's being done to address these specific concerns, including if someone is injured, how to respond, how to wait for medical personnel to get there?
Yeah, that's a basic thing that we're trained in. And we're looking at all our policies and procedures, and we're going to double down on that, where we have a set of questions that need to be asked while on body camera and answered. And if any of those answers are yes, you stop everything you're doing and you make sure they're seen by medical attention prior to anything else being done. And although medical attention was called, they didn't stop what they were doing, obviously. And that needs to be done. And another thing the mayor had said, I just want to elaborate on, we have trainers in the ABLE program and the ICAP program, which talk about duty to intervene. And there needs to be, our leadership needs to push down to all our officers that it's all right to question and say, hey, this doesn't look right. Hey, why are we doing this? And just one of those officers saying something like that would have stopped the whole process, and they would have gotten him medical attention. And we need to do that. And we need to also, another thing we're going to look into doing is an early warning system in internal affairs. And if we have officers with rudeness complaints, if we don't take care of that, now in the past we would take care of it with discipline. What I'm proposing is we take care of it with mentorship, and we pair officers up with officers that are really good at the job and treat people above and beyond. And so officers, we don't just discipline and move on. We need to identify problems, fix them, have mentorship. And if they're not fixing them, then we need to get rid of these officers. I said it the other night at the NAACP meeting. If officers treat people the way he treated Mr. Cox, We don't want them to be police officers.
You'd mentioned that this is basic training that was not followed. And so I wanted to get back to that, because if it's basic training that all police officers get, and it was not followed by at least 5 of these officers that interacted with Mr. Cox, what is going on, Assistant Chief Jacobson?
Well, like I said, we've had our problems, but most of our cops are committed to the safety and the well-being of the community. We just have to make it clear, and I want to fall back on something I've been talking about since the mayor nominated me, to legitimacy. And the first pillar of legitimacy is give everyone a voice. If Mr. Cox was given a voice, the Officer Diaz did call for rescue, but he should have stopped. And if he was given a voice and treated with dignity, we wouldn't be here talking about this today. So, and those are the first 2 pillars. So we really need to dig deep as an agency and work hard as an agency and show leadership and make some changes and just let it be known we're not going to tolerate this. And I think we have quickly, and that's going to lead to better results.
Mayor Elicker had mentioned the family of Richard Randy Cox. I wanted to play this audio that was gathered by Connecticut Public's Kay Perkins. This is LaToya Boomer, who's a sister of Mr. Cox, speaking the other day.
Seeing those videos, I couldn't watch. I started watching the videos, and the treatment of him was a disgrace. Where's the first aid training? Where's the on-the-job training? Where's the accountability? I want to know, where's the person that sees what's going on and says, maybe he's not joking, maybe he's not drunk, maybe he is in distress. He's laying on the floor saying, I think my neck is broke, I can't move, help, I can't move, I think my neck is broken.
I wanted to play that because that is the relative of Richard Randy Cox. And when we hear you say, Assistant Police Chief Jacobson, that you need to build trust within not only the department, but also how the community responds and thinks of its department, to know that, again, over and over, they ignored somebody who was injured, that needed help. I mean, how do you build that from the ground up? It sounds like there's something broken here.
Well, I think we have a lot of trust with the community, and we worked very hard after the George Floyd murder to build that trust and get back to a time when, even Tom Breen said it, we're starting to solve more homicides. We're starting to get more community collaboration. And this is a definite setback. So we have to put our hand out to the community, accept that what happened is wrong and that we're going to fix it. And it's almost like starting over and give everyone a voice, treatment with dignity. The other pillars are neutrality and decision-making and building trust. And we just got to start over with a large part of the community. And I understand, and the officers understand why people are upset with us.
If I may also respond, Lucy, I said this to Mr. Cox's family at the NAACP gathering the other night. Mr. Cox is a New Haven resident, and I'm the mayor of the whole city. I'm the mayor of Mr. Cox. So I come to this as a mayor, but I also come to this as a dad of 2 kids. And I can't imagine what it must be like for the family seeing that happen. I'd be angry and I'd want accountability. And part of the work that, and I deeply believe the New Haven Police Department has worked very, very hard to build trust in the community. Part of building trust is also how we respond to this incident. And we absolutely need to respond in a way that is decisive, that is open, and then ensures accountability. And we've been working very hard to do that. This is only the beginning of responding to this incident, but that trust is going to be built because we are committed to doing this the right way and responding in the right way.
Mayor, when we talk about the police department, and earlier both of you mentioned also the importance of training and being able to speak out when they see something happening that's wrong. But what is the structure of the New Haven Police Department? Is there a structure now that would discourage people who may be at a lower rank from pushing back on someone who is their supervisor?
No,
Chief,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely not. There's no discouragement. You wouldn't be disciplined to say that. We actually train people to say that. We recently are training a new academy that will be coming out on July 6th, and they've had extensive training in ABLE and ICAT to actually go about saying, no, this isn't right. We need to stop. And think about that. Of those 5 officers, if one person had done that, we would not be sitting here today. We would not be talking about rebuilding the trust that we were building. Like, we were moving in the right direction. We have lower amount of homicides in any large city in Connecticut by tenfold. And that's because we were building trust again. And we have to start over.
Why were the police department still using these vans that don't have seat belts? When we think about how easy it is for any of us to, when we enter a car, if there's an abrupt stop or if there's an accident, to be thrown forward. That's why we wear seat belts. Why is that same not given to those who are arrested and in these vehicles being transported, Assistant Chief Jacobson?
So back after the 2015 incident in Baltimore, we redid our policies in 2016, and we added the loops of holding on and signs in the vans that say hold on to the loops. At that time, that's what the leadership at the time came up with. The post even doesn't require you to have seatbelts. They consider prisoner vans like school buses. Like, why doesn't school buses have seatbelts? But clearly it wasn't the right decision at that time. And we've taken those vans off the road and we've added seatbelts, and we're going to do everything possible for this to never happen again. At the time, back in 2016, that was the policy change. These loops were added. When we purchased a new van recently, it did come with seatbelts. So, it wasn't the right decision, obviously, and we're going to do everything possible to right the wrong.
Mayor, were you surprised that these vehicles were still being used?
Yeah, I mean, I've been mayor for 2.5 years, and this incident brought to my attention that 2 out of 3 of the transport vans that we use do not have seatbelts. And while it is not required by the state, we clearly we will respond, and we're taking, as the assistant chief said, the vans off the road. Our cruisers all have seatbelts, and officers are required to securely buckle people in. And once we're working to update our standard operating procedures, and clearly that will be a part of our policy moving forward.
That's New Haven Mayor Justin Elicker here on Where We Live. Thank you for your time, Mayor.
Thank you.
Also with us, New Haven Assistant Police Chief Karl Jacobson. He is the mayor's nominee to be permanent chief. We thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up after the break, we're going to talk about a U.S. Supreme Court ruling on Miranda rights and how that could impact policing in the future. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Now, there's a lot of U.S. Supreme Court news to dissect in recent days. And with our focus on policing earlier in the show, we wanted to talk about a ruling that could impact Miranda rights protections in the future. With more, joining us on Zoom is Jorge Camacho, Policing Law and Policy Director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School. Jorge, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lucy. Good morning.
Most of us know what Miranda rights are, but briefly explain them and the case before the Supreme Court.
Sure. So Miranda rights are those things that you always hear uttered in every TV cop procedural show ever made. Whenever they're arresting a suspect, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided to you by the court. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. These warnings were first prescribed by the Supreme Court in 1966 in a case known as Miranda versus Arizona, and which is why they're known today as Miranda warnings. In that case, the court examined the question of coercion and voluntariness during police custodial interrogations and determined that in order to protect people from what they believed was the inherently coercive nature of police interrogations, that prior to interrogating anyone who was in custody, police officers would have to inform the subject of the interrogation of these rights, of the right to remain silent, of the right to an attorney, et cetera. And that only if the person was informed of these rights, could the court or any other court presume that their subsequent statement was made knowingly and voluntarily. Fast forward to this year, there was a case, Vega versus Tico, in which the question before the court was whether or not someone who had made incriminating statements could sue the police officer who interrogated them in federal court under a federal law known as Section 1983, if that officer had failed to read him his Miranda rights before the interrogation. Section 1983 requires that there be some kind of deprivation of a civil right rooted either in the Constitution, a constitutional right, or in a law, in a federal law. So the question before the court was, well, is the requirement under Miranda to read these warnings prior to interrogating someone, is that either a constitutional right for purposes of 1983 or a legal right made under federal law? The court held no, that it's neither a constitutional right, nor a legal right, nor a statutory right, and that therefore you could not sue someone under this section of federal law in court if they failed you to read your rights. The repercussions of this decision are that one of the most significant causes of action for pursuing civil rights claims against officers in federal court has now been entirely foreclosed for situations where people make self-incriminating statements after not having been read their Miranda rights.
Given that ruling, so people are left with few, if any, options to seek relief?
It really depends. Right now, what this leaves you with primarily is still the core holding in Miranda, which is that any self-incriminating statement made that was made without the benefit of this advance warning of your rights would be suppressed at trial and could not be used in a criminal trial against that individual. However, that holding has kind of been slowly chipped away over the years, and there are now a series of exceptions to that ruling. And now, with this new decision under Vega, the possibility of seeking a civil remedy, including damages or suing for money or some other type of relief under 1983, is now no longer available. If there isn't a state law analog to Miranda or a state law analog to Section 1983, where you could sue under that law, then this really leaves people with very few options aside from seeking the exclusion of evidence at a criminal trial. But that doesn't help you if you were never criminally prosecuted for the offense that you were interrogated about.
What about a longer impact? Could this impact arrests and police business when they interrogate a subject? Could we see law enforcement stop reading Miranda rights, or is that jumping ahead too much?
I think you could see some change in police behavior. Now, again, the exclusionary rule still applies, right? So that could serve as a deterrent or an incentive to read these warnings in spite of the fact that civil liability is greatly reduced now. But you still may have police officers who perhaps, will feel less obligated to read these rights, knowing that civil liability is much less likely. Again, especially if the prospect of a criminal prosecution just isn't on the horizon for the individual, but they still want to gain information from someone who they're interrogating for purposes of some other kind of investigation.
You're hearing George Camacho here on Where We Live, Policing Law and Policy Director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School, as we talk about the SCOTUS ruling related to Miranda. Now, I understand police currently are able to lie when interrogating witnesses. So how does that connect back to Miranda rights, George?
Well, so yes, you're right. The Supreme Court has held that you can use subterfuge, right? You can lie, you can misdirect. You can, kind of imply things that perhaps are less than the truth during an interrogation in order to elicit a statement, provided that the interrogation is otherwise not coercive. And that includes, reading Miranda warnings in advance of the interrogation. What this does is that this ruling, to the extent, again, that it removes at least some component of incentive for reading these warnings in advance, it makes the impact of the subterfuge more powerful potentially, especially again if the deterrent of exclusion of evidence at trial isn't enough of a motivating factor for police officers.
We just have a couple of minutes left, but you anticipate, could there be more cases headed to the SCOTUS related to Miranda warnings?
Absolutely. The Supreme Court is currently composed of at least 6 justices who clearly view Miranda skeptically. And even though this case, Vega, presented, again, the relatively narrow question of whether there was civil liability under this federal law, the next Miranda case, whatever that may be, could present to the court the square question of whether the exclusionary rule should apply. And you have 6 justices who have made it clear that Miranda is not a constitutional right, that its prescriptions are not constitutionally rooted in the way that other constitutional rights are, and that really Miranda is a creation of the court, which basically means that as much as the court may have been free to create it, it may also be free to undo it.
Briefly for our listeners, what should they be considering as they hear this and think about Miranda rights? How to better educate individuals about these rights, George?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are 2 main things that can and should be done. Education is absolutely a component of it. And people now, I think have some modicum of understanding of what their rights may be. Although, again, once you're in the situation of being interrogated, whether or not you can kind of objectively sit back and assess your rights, given the inherently coercive nature of many police interrogations, is I think a legitimate question to ask. But really, what can be done and should be done is to kind of minimize reliance on the Supreme Court to both establish and recognize and to reaffirm these kinds of prescriptions and these kinds of rights. Because even if Miranda kind of goes away, even if the court undoes it, that doesn't mean that states and local governments and even the federal government can't require the same thing under law, under policy. And so, Miranda, even if the court views its constitutional origins with skepticism, doesn't mean that Miranda itself is not good policy to have. In fact, I think there are many, many reasons for police departments to continue to inform people of their rights, even in the event that the Supreme Court reverses Miranda. But the only way to guarantee that happens is to pass laws to that effect.
That's George Camacho, Policing Law and Policy Director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School. Thank you for your time, George.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical director is Kat Pastor. We'll be back tomorrow.